So, welcome back to Third Age Reforged and to another battle replay, and today I'm actually going to be doing the replay that I've been given, at least in Reforged terms, the most recently. And that's because there is an episodic series that I want to do one after the other. Now, it's possible that this is actually part of that and I was sent it twice. I will double check that. If that is the case, then this will effectively be either one of the battles in the episodic series that I've been given, but I'd like to do those in order, 1 through 3. So this one will be coming either before that or as part of it, as I've just mentioned. And I didn't want to do both of the scenarios that Eclipse sent me one after the other anyway. I did want to have a little bit of gap between the two of them, even if it's just one battle, so that we're not we're basically just having a little bit of variety for variety's own sake, really. And this is a map that we haven't seen before either. I didn't have to download any map files for this one, so I assume it was part of the game anyway. The replay was called the City of Lannas, so that is what I will be calling it from here on out as well. It is a cityscape map, and what's the point? It's actually a very open cityscape map, and I think the defenders are going to have to choose one side or the other to defend. It does look as though they are going to be choosing this one, which makes sense. This is where the dwarves are starting. After all, it's going to be the dwarves and the elves of Mirkwood on the defence today. A match that should really be made in heaven. The Mirkwood elves, obviously at range and in terms of their damage dealing potential in melee, are very, very good. And then if you combine that with the solidity and heavy armour that the dwarves of Khazad bring in spades, you should be in for a pretty good time of it if you can manage to play well. It's all well and good having a good composition, but you need to be able to use it effectively as well. You can see that Rhun are over there as well, and they're going to be joined by Isengard, and over there on the far side we also have Rhudaur, so it's going to be a fully good versus evil battle that we have today. But like I said, quite an open cityscape this. There are many choke points that the defenders can make use of, but the problem with most of these more open cityscapes that we've seen is that the attackers can also use their own ranged units pretty much freely, and that could be a bit of a problem. However, with the solidity of the dwarves and the damage of the elves at range, that may not be the same sort of advantage as we have been used to seeing, and ultimately the settlement is quite an awkward shape as well, so if the defenders dig in properly, they should be just fine. We'll go through the attacking armies first and foremost though, as we usually do, starting off with Tintin, who is playing as Rhudaur. Rhudaur, probably among the attackers, are the most vulnerable because of their lower armour and lower melee defence all around, but they will provide a very important service here, and that's going to be with their range damage, not so much with their archers, but we'll get into a couple of the javelins that we can at least see in just a moment. One thing with Rhudaur, of course, is that they do have plenty of units which can hide, which means we will only be seeing a portion of the Rhudaur army until the rest of it reveals itself. But as I said, because of the openness of this settlement, stuff like the Dunman Hunters can be used to pretty good effect. The elves won't want to be using their high priority ammunition on something as lowly as this, but if they don't, the Dunman Hunters could take the slower approach and slowly chip away at the manpower that the defenders have, which is going to be a bad thing for them. Elves and dwarves, smaller armies certainly, in comparison to evil men and orcs. But this is where Rhudaur really shine, of course, in their javelins. The Etten Troll Hunters, they have a bit more armour than most other Rhudaur units are used to. It's still not up to the same standards as some of the other Western Kingdoms of Men, but it's better than it otherwise would be, so they're going to be a little bit more resilient against ranged attacks, which is going to be important because it's going to be one of those units which the enemy are going to want to try and focus down. Because if you allow the Etten Troll Hunters to start bombarding your infantry line, you're going to be in pretty significant trouble, I would suggest, if you're the defenders in this situation. While the archers will slowly chip away at you, the javelins will really whittle you down rather quickly. The same can also be said of axe throwers. The THRANDUIL berserkers don't have that much ammunition at range, however. The Trollshaw axe throwers might, and given the fact that they can hide, and this is a rather small looking army from Rhudaur, I'd be very surprised if the Trollshaws were not here. What the Trollshaws lack in melee, however, the THRANDUIL berserkers most certainly pick up the slack there. A fantastic unit of armour-piercing bodyguard units in melee as well. Not quite as good as the Witchram slavers we see back there, but more on them in just a moment. But the multifaceted nature of them will make them a very useful tool, especially against the dwarves. The armour-piercing, excuse me, parts to Rhudaur's army make them really useful against a faction like Khazad, and the armour-piercing is not quite enough to make up for the huge gulf in average quality, but it's certainly a big equaliser, and then when you add the numbers into that as well, The waters are well and truly muddied when you consider the fight that will happen between them. Rhudaur swordsman, very much just a rank and file swordsman here. They're going to be obviously thoroughly outclassed by the units that they face, but maybe not as much as something like the Dunman spearmen, who are little better than fodder. They're not quite as garbage as the Orc faction's fodder units, like the Orc fodder, Snarker skirmishers and the like, or the Snarker stalkers and the like. But their extreme cheapness may actually mean they're overall a more efficient unit than stuff like the Dunman spearmen and the Haradrim spearmen, which are probably the closest approximation to them in another faction. 2 more units of swordsmen, and like I said, back here the Witch-Armored Slavers, which are by far the best unit Rhudaur can field in a pure melee circumstance, and the huge armour-piercing damage they can deal is also something that the dwarves in particular will be a little bit concerned about at the very least, and they will be hoping that they can deal with them before they get into melee. Isengard, the most well-rounded faction of the attackers today. They have the least amount of armour piercing available to them outside of more specialty troops, when you consider the amount that Rhun and Rhudaur can field. The Dunlending veterans, it's an interesting choice to bring the Dunlending veterans here actually from Son of the Dunedain. They do have better damage, but against the quality that the dwarves and elves can bring, it might have been more worthwhile to bring something like Uruk-hai Raiders. They don't do as much damage, but there are slightly more of them. And ultimately the non-AP damage of one-handed axemen I don't think is going to be enough to get through the melee defense of the elves nor the armour of the dwarves, but still, it's a numerous enough infantry unit for not an awful lot of cost. Champions of the White Hand is actually, I think, a good unit to bring on this occasion because it's a rather open settlement, and it makes the chances of, in particular Mirkwood, sallying forth with some cavalry and being annoying, because the Champions of the White Hand are going to be more than sufficient to deal with pretty much everything that the defenders can field at them in a cavalry sense. The Sindar of the Girdle are a little bit different perhaps, in that if the Sindar of the Girdle got a good charge off on the Champions of the White Hand, it might be a little bit interesting, but overall this is not a fight that the elves would want to be taking, because the best you can hope for really is mutually assured destruction in that situation, and that's something that Isengard can absorb far more easily than the defenders can on this occasion. Uruk-hai infantry, a very solid core as always to the Isengard army, very effective in melee, but also that armour and shield that they have is going to make them a little bit more resilient to the inevitable arrow storm that they're going to be facing on the march through the settlement. Uruk-hai pikemen in all likelihood are going to be saved until later in the fight. If they are pushed forward first, then both the Dwarven and Elven archers are going to be having a field day with them. Dunlending clansmen, not too dissimilar perhaps to the Dunman spearmen that we've already seen, although the Dunlanders here do have a slightly higher anti-cavalry bonus that they can bring to the field. Another reason why sallying out against Isengard is maybe not the best idea. Warg skirmishers as well. This is, I think, another good pick, because even though if you bring too much cavalry you could end up ultimately just being not very useful, but the Warg skirmishers, if all else fails, can be used in the same way that normal javelins can, and then they can also be used for their mass in the very late game as a sort of Hail Mary or as a final nail in the defender's coffin. Not too surprising to see the Uruk-hai crossmen either. If there's one part of warfare that Isengard can dominate at range, much in the same way Rhudaur can with their javelins, then at mid-range the crossbows here are going to be very, very useful, but it's also going to be one of those targets that Mirkwood are going to have to be on the lookout for, and will very likely be trying to scythe through them with their archers. We've got some Trolls of the White Hand, some Uruk-hai Berserkers, some Guards of Orthanc and some Nazkai as well. So a mix of mostly high damage units, the Nazkai and the Berserkers, that big AP damage they have, the Trolls, timing going to be key with them, and then the much more defensive Guards of Orthanc. An expensive endeavour this, but perhaps a little bit of quality. Isengard seeing themselves as perhaps the highest quality faction of the attackers, maybe. The split between the mid and lower tiers and the high tiers over here. Rhun might have something to say about that though. They are a balanced faction in their own right, they just have a little bit more of a slant towards armour piercing rather than just the all-round approach Isengard do. Eastron clansmen, varying levels of armour upgrades here, including the flag rim. With all this AP, to be fair, Mirkwood may be in the best place among the two defenders to be universally effective, whereas Khazad are going to have to be a little bit more careful against all this armour piercing that they may face. The Gamprim are a potential threat, especially considering Mirkwood don't have access to any phalanx units, but if Khazad have brought any of their pikes at all and they manage to keep their shape well enough, the Gamprim should be held at arm's length very effectively, especially by something like the First Legion. Scion Rim, a very tanky unit of spears, giving Rhun that upper end solidity that they may need. Nar Rim, Balkoth Tribesmen, Eastron crossbows, so the full range here of ranged units. You have the archers, the lower end javelins, and then also the crossbows with the armour upgrade as well, trying to mitigate some of that inevitable damage. Gen Moo Moo thinks that they're going to be taking, interesting name. The general going to be in the Carmel's Chosen over here. Pretty run-of-the-mill as far as bodyguard units go, but they are shielded, which in this battle may be a virtue in and of itself. And the Dragon's Breath, interesting to see that this is the artillery that the attackers have decided to bring. I don't know whether they're going to have the angle to use this if they get caught either down here in the lower section of the settlement or on the hills leading up to the area that I imagine the defenders are going to try and dig in around. If they can get into a position, then it's a problem for the defenders, but if not, it could end up being a large waste of money. We shall have to wait and see. Now then, we now move on to the defenders, starting off with Mark Trainerstad? I'm going to call him Mark from here on out. He's left a unit of Dwarven miners behind. I'd be extremely surprised if they were allowed to escape. It is the lowliest of all of his units, so if you're going to lose something for free, I suppose it may as well be this. He should be fairly grateful that Rhudaur don't have any of their cavalry, or at least not that we can see. He may have some Dunman outrunners, Tintin, they can hide. The champions, the White Hand, should still catch them anyway there. They're not going to be able to run up that way. We'll see. But every little helps in this sort of situation. They are outnumbered 2 to 3 here, the defenders. They can't afford to lose units cheaply, even if it is the most entry-level units you have. A couple of units of Orc Hunters. I mean, they are a very damaging unit. They are pretty much the equivalent of some of the more basic units of Elven Archers. Khazad, they do have other units of that are a threat at range, but we'll get on to one of them at the very least in just a moment because I can see it in the background. But as far as archers go, they are actually pretty decent, and the fact that they do have a long range option, unlike their cousins in Erebor, is a boon for them, but they do completely forego crossbows as a result. Another unit of Dwarven miners here, 4th Legion Shield Guard without the armour upgrade, which is interesting, but they're still solid enough on the front line. Here are the Khazad Reclaimers. This is the one area perhaps where throwing projectiles, they could contest it with Rhudaur. The sheer volume that Rhudaur are able to bring does outstrip the quality that the Reclaimers have. But the Reclaimers are also fantastic armor-piercing shock troops in melee. A couple of units of Sons of the Fallen, fantastic at holding the line. More units of 4th Legion Shield Guards. I mean, he's got tons of Spearmen here, so he's going to be very, very solid on the front line. Maybe a little bit of interplay with his ally in the composition phase, maybe. A couple of units of Miners, the Mighty Mithril Guard, another more defensive pick. The more aggressive one would have been the Guards of Khazad with their armor-piercing damage, but given the opposition, maybe armor-piercing wouldn't have been as universally useful, especially given the close proximity of Rhudaur. And armor-piercing can ultimately be picked up by other units in Khazad's roster, speaking of which, the Locked Morale Hammers of Gundabad could be really, really useful against the likes of Isengard. Pikes, good to see at least a single unit of them. Is there another unit in here that can be counted upon? No, so maybe not as much of a phalanx presence as I would like to see from Khazad here, given the fact that his ally cannot field any, even if they wanted to. Few units of 3rd and 2nd Legion back here, a 2nd unit of sentries, but that's as far as the Khazad pike presence goes. It is a rather defensive... Actually, no, there are 3 units of sentries of Khazad. I do take it back. There's another one over there. That's enough of a phalanx, I think, but it is a very defensive infantry forces from Khazad, maybe a little bit conservative, but that does play well with potentially what Mirkwood can bring. Speaking of which, it is Master Blast. A big thank you to him for sending this battle we play in. Wardens of Amon Lank, a unit which is armor-piercing in melee, but really strong at range as well. The Elders of the Elven King with their Silverthorn arrows, a ballista, so a bit of siege, which could be useful, and given the high ground that they could have, they should be able to snipe out something like the Dragon's Breath relatively easily, but they may not even want to, because they may be able to go after other things. The Dragon's Breath, if it can't get into a good position, it may be a waste, like I said. Some unupgraded Hiri Alf, but they don't necessarily need the armor upgrade on this occasion. With all the armor piercing the attackers have, it may even be, you could even consider it to be a waste of money depending on how you're playing Tetris with your funds. We've got some Hiri Ek over here as well. Greenwood Watchers, the Elven Assassins, an interesting pick. We also have a couple of units of Woodland Realm Patrol, the more basic unit of Archers. Greenwood Rangers, unsurprising to see them, of course, with the body piercing and the extra point of damage that Elven Rangers have, also very useful. Hiriak, and then a couple of units of cavalry. We do have the Sindar of the Girdle, the bodyguard tier unit, and they're going to be flanked by the Bows of Amenduia, a unit of Horse Archers. The Horse Archers I would save, and I would actually save the cavalry, just generally speaking, until later. If the champions of the White Hand want to pursue you into the backfield, then you can easily pick them off with archers first, and then finish off what's left with the Sindar of the Girdle, and that is one way that you can achieve cavalry dominance on the field. You'll have to dump an awful lot of your Horse Archer ammunition into it, but it would be arrows well spent when you then have 2 units of cavalry that you can use to hammer and anvil the attackers later on, but I'll have to wait and see if that's what they do. I'm just speculating at this point. I will make a cut, although I'm not sure how long it will be. It might be quite short if the attackers do manage to hunt down this unit of dwarven miners that are over here. We'll just have to wait and see though. I'll rejoin when the first blood is shed. So I'm going to rejoin here because I do believe that the battle is not going to be too far removed from this point. The actual bloodshed has not yet begun, but you can see that Rhun has already managed to get up onto the higher terrain, so the dwarves and the elves are not actually going to be defending from the front of this raised area, which in some ways is understandable, but in other ways I think is a little bit of a mistake because you're allowing Rhun to get on the same plane as you, and if that's the case then the point behind occupying this high ground in particular is lessened a little bit, especially seeing as Rhun are the ones you really want to be keeping off this level because it means they could get their Dragon's Breath into position. As much as it's not the devastating monster that it once was, it could still be a real problem for the defenders as they dig in here, and it is actually interesting to note that I do believe that the other side maybe would have been a little bit easier to defend as it pertains to digging in, because there's a little bit more of there's an easier last stand over here. I think you can back yourself up into a corner a little bit more, but the dwarves would have had to traverse pretty much the whole map, and there's a very real chance the attackers could have intercepted them. That unit of dwarven miners did get back into the defensive area, however, so they didn't end up losing anything. Rhudaur maybe could have shot them on the retreat, but they decided not to in the end, which I find to be quite interesting. This could be a real nightmare. If the dwarves actually did want to shuffle forward a little bit and defend this area, it could be horrid. Isengard, the unlucky souls that may have had to pass through there, but I don't think the dwarves are going to go that close. They would have to defend 2 areas quite tightly together after all. Isengard probably the best placed to try and fight their way through that little area, but no one really wants to be going into a defence like that against the dwarves. And also, you can see here, Mirkwood have elected to put their cavalry within this area as well, which means that's going to be a late game consideration when they maybe try to break out, but it is also the sort of thing that could end up taking stray arrow shots and other such projectiles from the attackers if they choose to try and bring them down. Meanwhile, the arrows now flying from both sides, the Dunman Hunters trying to do a little bit of damage to these units on the front. The Hiri Elves maybe need to push forward a little bit more so that the Dwarven pikes are not so exposed. Those Mirkwood shields will really come in handy, and you need those pikes. They're going to need to do a bit of heavy lifting for you, but these are the kind of units, of course, that the defenders are going to be reliant upon. As I said at the start of the battle, I do think Mirkwood are going to be the key protagonists in this fight. They've already opened up with a couple of volleys on what, I wonder. There's a few dead units there, actually just basic archers. Interesting. I mean, something like the Rhudaur Axemen would make for a very tempting target. They can hide, of course, which means they can pop out of existence, but while they are visible, they're very, very vulnerable, and that armor piercing will be useful at hounding your allies. The dwarves will not enjoy going up against them. The Eastron clansmen, are they taking arrow fire? I believe they are, which Gen Mumu over here will not mind too much that he's taking a little bit of arrow fire. From what is the question? Orc hunters. But even so, this is pretty much one of the weakest units on the field. They're going to be a little bit more dangerous in melee than the basic spears that the Dunlanders and the Northmen can provide, but even so, ammunition would be much better used elsewhere, and these Eastron clansmen will be fulfilling a service that they need done. This is a little bit of an interest. It's a very complex settlement, this. There's a lot going on here, which is a little bit bizarre. Warg skirmishers moving in, they're going to try and throw some javelins and then go back. Bows of Emondwyr responding in kind. Those javelins will do a decent amount of damage to whatever units they are able to hit, but they're going to get forced back pretty quickly by 2 units of archers. They're going to try and get in behind the buildings here and continue to do damage. Maybe the javelins would be better placed not going after a unit as basic as miners, but just trying to take away what numbers the defenders have may leave them unable to withstand an all-out offensive later on. Eastron crossbowmen moving forward just to make sure that the Warg skirmishers can't be too easily engaged in melee. The clansmen are also pushing up as well. So far, I mean, the Warg skirmishers are obviously getting killed at a fair rate, but they're also doing a decent amount of damage here. Nothing too decisive one way or the other at the moment, but of course, as we've learned time and time again in this game, the attackers have more margin for error when they have and the advantage of an army or perhaps 2. So they can afford to be a little bit more gung-ho. The Elven Ballista getting into place. Rhun not yet pushing hard down this way. The attackers in general haven't really got down to business yet. They're just sort of feeling their way into position. Rhudaur swordsmen nearby, Dunman hunters ballooning a few arrows into the defence. And Woodland Realm Patrol, I mean, they're not the most tanky unit of archers at range. Only a unit of very basic archers that they're taking damage from, so low base damage and fairly low accuracy, but even so, this is not the sort of thing that Mirkwood can really afford to completely ignore and not change anything. They either need to move their archers out of there or try to respond in some way, which is why I would have liked to see the Sindar of the Girdle remain outside of this defensive area. You may have had to run them away from the champions of the White Hand continuously, but especially if you had the bowmen there, I think you could have made that work. But unfortunately that's not going to be the case, so you're going to have to just sort of sit there and hope that you can deal with the attackers putting pressure on, because that is one of the big conundrums of a siege battle often. Having to try and deal with the attackers having numerous skirmishes that they can use to just poke at your defence continuously, and then you have to potentially use your very important ammunition on something that you'd really rather not. At the very least, these E-Strong clansmen are no longer taking up unnecessary ammunition from the defenders. Most of Rhune's army still back here as they slowly push their artillery piece forward. These strong clansmen also over there. It's interesting. Dunman hunters that are out of ammunition. This is a little bit of a mistake from Tintin, as I said. There's some Dunman spearmen and hunters, but unless you're committing forward something that's got a little bit of quality behind it, these poor Northlanders are going to be easily dealt with by a combination of the Elven Swordsman and Dwarven Pikemen. And as if that wasn't enough, it also gives the opportunity for the Sindar of the Girdle to maybe escape. That wasn't really too much of an effective charge, that, but it's very, very likely that these entry-level Rhudaur units are going to rout without really achieving much of anything. The use of the Dunman Hunters' ammunition initially has been quite good, but throwing them into melee like this isn't really necessary. They're never going to get a ton of kills in melee, but they can make a useful meat shield when you're actually advancing in a big way. And they add mass to your front line as well, which can be very effective, as we've seen time and time again, but it's not going to be the case this time. Those Dunman Hunters are exposed though, so if Master Blaster does break out with the Sindar of the Girdle, which he's going to do now, these could be worrying moments in this battle for Rhudaur, because of how far back their main army is, and how exposed some of the initial units they've sent forward are. The Sindar of the Girdle could really clean up here. There's nothing too important to Rhudaur's efforts here, but it's a lot of numbers they could end up losing. A nice rear charge is probably going to be the end of this particular unit, I would suggest. Eerie Peng also firing down the hill, doing some initial damage to these units of Rhudaur's swordsmen. Sindar of the Girdle are also going to charge downhill now as well. Lots of damage being sustained here by Rhudaur. And as I said, they are the most fragile of the attacking factions today. Their armour, their defence, just in general. They have to move forward with something a little bit more. Having some of their throwing projectiles nearby would have helped mitigate some of this. I mean, the Sindar of the Girdle are taking some damage, some of the ammunition hitting them. Just in general, they're a little bit more lightweight. They've got very good melee defense and they're dangerous off the charge as well, but yeah, not an awful lot of damage there from Rhudaur. You can see there are a few dead units, but most of those I would honestly put down to the volleys of arrows that we saw earlier on, more so than the melee combatants. These Rhudaur swordsmen, having already taken tons of damage very, very quickly, are now being thrown under the bus as well. This smacks a little bit of panic from the Rhudaur player, I have to say. He's trying to make something happen. He sees that he's losing a ton of manpower very, very quickly, and he's just sending forward more and more units. And also sending forward these Rhudaur axemen now as well, really struggling. The Elven archers starting to go to work on them as well. So, scary hours for Rhudaur. He's going to have to try and change things around, maybe play a little bit more conservatively until his allies are ready to get into a position to assist as well. Rhun in particular needs to start pushing down the middle lane. Isengard are at least putting up some sort of an effort. The E-Strong crossmen firing in. Crossbow bolts coming in. The Dwarven miners as an entry-level unit are obviously going to be superior to the Dunlending clansmen. Could be that saving that single unit of miners does prove to be a fairly decisive action. We'll have to wait and see. Those bows of Emondwyr have already taken a little bit of damage. Looks like the crossbow bolts are actually going after the ranged units back here, the Orc Hunters and the Eerie Peng. So a combination of Dwarven and Elven archers firing into the background over there. Very interesting to see that the Dragon's Breath is coming over here. Much better served going down the middle lane, I would have thought. These strong crossbows trying to do some damage. Just where their armour upgrade will pay some dividends. Make them a little bit more resilient to that arrow fire they're taking, but it's still going to be too much for them to bear over the long hauls. They're going to have to get out of the way if they want to maintain their health. Still not a great deal of movement from Rhun down this way. There's more E-Strong clansmen getting ready to mass over, but this is also the biggest area they could attack. I'm a little bit surprised they're not going a little bit harder in for that. Meanwhile, Rhudaur coming back once again. They're trying to... I mean, they're using their archers in a pretty decent manner, as I continue to say, but again, the Rhudaur swordsmen that have returned from routing, surely not for too long, as the Dwarven units get their pikes down. The Elven units are in there as well. I mean, the Elven units in particular are going to be really, really effective against the low armour, low melee defence mass of Rhudaur units that they've been faced with so far. Mirkwood very much in their element. So they're going to rout off again. I think these Dunman Hunters were the ones that were here previously as well. They're going to be even worse in melee in this sort of situation than the Rhudaur swordsmen, significantly so. I'd be impressed if they got a single kill in this situation, like I said. My apologies for that, the recording just decided to stop. I've restarted it now. Hopefully Nvidia doesn't attempt to mess me around too much. Their incompetence truly knows no bounds these days. But Sindar the Girdle pushing out, the Elves maybe wasting a little bit of ammunition, as I said, over here, trying to hit a unit of Rhudaur swordsmen, which is healthier admittedly, but is also a little bit more out of the way. I mean, Rhudaur are in real trouble here. I think their allies need to recognise that Rhudaur are bleeding manpower, and they need to maybe bring forward their plans a little bit, maybe be a little bit more traditionally aggressive as the attackers. As much as they've been trying to trade efficiently and maybe play the long game here, there's only so far that will take you when one of your allies is in real trouble. Dwarven miners continuing to be dominant in melee against the Dunlanders, but they are now taking hits in the side from these strong crossbows, but maybe the dwarves won't mind that too much, the fact that they're taking crossbow bolts only to a very basic unit. But I think between Rhun and Isengard, they've got enough crossbow bolts to the point where they can afford to maybe be a little bit flippant, if it means that they can gain some map territory here and try and start pushing the elves and dwarves back along this area. Another unit of Dunlending clansmen coming forward, so still being conservative with the quality of the units they're sending forward, but with these numbers, with those crossbow bolts, they should at least be able to get this single unit of miners out of the way fairly quickly, you would imagine. Meanwhile, back over here, I think that unit of Hiri Pang has run out of ammunition now, so it's a sign that they've been hitting Rhudaur fairly continuously now. Serious unit as well. The Elders of the Elven King may be looking to do some more damage against Rhudaur. They need to make sure they do have some resources to use against the likes of Rhun later on. Rhun now coming forward a little bit more so. A couple of units of Eastron clansmen. They need more quality though if they're going to engage like this. Similar sort of problem could face Rhun as has already faced Rhudaur, where they simply don't have enough quality to actually make any gains. The Eastron clansmen will be slightly better than the Dunlending clansmen against the miners, but you would still back the dwarves in this fight between lower tier units to be victorious. That extra little bit of damage they do, it's armor piercing damage as well, so even the fact that the Eastron clansmen over here are upgraded isn't going to be the boon that maybe they would want it to be. Hunters are also ready. They've got plenty of support nearby should they need it. Sons of the Fallen will provide an impenetrable wall against units as basic as Eastron clansmen. Maybe a little bit more questionable against Rhune's armor-piercing core. The Flagrim will be a little bit more capable in fights like that, but they're going to need plenty of support. It's going to be all about combined arms here, I think, for the attackers, and they need to be a little bit less about sending just their basic units to die rather ineffectively. Otherwise, they themselves are going to be the ones that ultimately run out of manpower, and they're not going to win a quality war in the late game against dwarves and elves if that's what they intend to make it. They need to make it all about their quality. Still, that Easterling artillery is back over there. Uruk-hai Berserkers very far away. I'm a little bit unsure as to why they're that far away, but they're not maybe going to try and avoid taking arrow fire, perhaps. Those Eastron clans and routing very quickly. So yeah, Rhun at the moment going the same way as Rhudaur, you would have to say. All kinds of Khazad now starting to open up as well, trying to do damage to the Balkoth tribesmen that are coming forward in support. The dwarves also moving forward a unit of 4th Legion Shield Guard to make sure the line is solid enough to withstand any uptick in quality, although as I say that they're about to retreat, maybe fearing the armor piercing damage at range and in melee that Rhun are now bringing to the table. A little bit more of a threat perhaps to the Dwarven lines, but Flagrim, there's also those clear projectiles in the Greenwood Rangers ripping along those runic ranks now, so they're going to have to be cognizant of the fact that Rangers are now turning themselves onto them. Isengard still have got those Dunlending clansmen. There's a few crossbows getting in position. They're threading the needle quite nicely, hitting that unit of sentries, but all of this is rather slow progress from Isengard, which certainly Rhudaur can't afford, and as the battle continues, Rhun might not be able to afford it either, which is a concern. Got a feel for Rhudaur a little bit here. I mean, I don't think Tintin approached this battle in the right way thus far, but also, when you're having to fight uphill into Mirkwood, that is a pretty bad matchup for Rhudaur, all things considered. Might be one of the worst matchups you could hope for, actually. Under normal circumstances, something like Rhudaur Axeman as part of a combined assault might be efficient, but not here. Not against the quality in the melee defense, the damage, all of those things that Mirkwood can lay down. It's going to be very, very difficult for you. And even if you are able to get some decent arrow shots off, you still have the solidity of the dwarves to worry about. Forward come the Blackwolds. Their second hit point will help them, but they're also going to be a very clear target for the Elders of the Elven King. Worthwhile to go after them because they are dangerous, especially to the dwarven elements of this defence with that armour piercing that they have. And also they're very vulnerable to arrow fire. You can also stop their advance with those Silverthorn arrows. The Ballista now firing. Ripping through the Dunlanding clansmen. Maybe that's it. Well, actually no, they've actually managed to hit one of the huge bombards, so one of the runic artillery pieces has been destroyed so far. I think the defenders have played reasonably well so far. They haven't had to be that spectacular, they've just had to keep their shape and allow the attackers to throw themselves at their lines in a rather haphazard fashion, but they themselves have reacted well to it. That's all you can do. You can only beat the attacks that are in front of you. Narvrim, they've taken an awful lot of damage, which would suggest that the elves have been engaging in a skirmish fight with them. But they're still continuing to try and do a little bit of damage as the Wooden Round Patrol goes back into hiding. Still taking damage, interestingly enough. I think they're actually trying to go after the Sons of the Fallen in behind, but it's as a result, the unit that's hiding on top of the hill is the one that's taking damage. It worked out in a roundabout way for them. Still the Ballista continues to try and gain a bit of a foothold. These Hiri Peng have taken a little bit of damage. Sentries of Khazad. Again, more waste on those ballista bolts. Warg skirmishers moving forward, immediately taking a volley, and several of them falling by the wayside again. But I'd imagine they're out of ammunition. Trying to chew through a bit more of the defending ranged threats. I can see what Isengard are doing. I just don't think they have the time to be approaching things in this way. If Rhudaur and Rhun had both done the same thing, Rhun have done it a little bit more so, but Rhudaur are in trouble here. They've sent forward more units fairly consistently to try and keep the attack going, but they haven't really made enough gains. They have killed some of the defenders here. It's not been like totally embarrassing, but it's not been great. And Rhudaur are going to have to hope that their allies can start pressurising the defences on the other side a little bit more. Then maybe they can send forward what they have left and make it a three-front war for the defenders. If Rhudaur are completely destroyed before Rhun and Isengard genuinely start pushing forward, it could end up being a bit of a problem ultimately for Rhun and Isengard. That was interesting. So the Dragon's Breath Cannon did get a good hit there and actually managed to kill off a really decent number of these Sons of the Fallen. A fortuitous shot. That's exactly the sort of thing the attackers need to start gaining back some of the kills they've lost in this fight so far. Orc Hunters shuffling around a little bit. The Warns Mammon like moving over here. This is what I would say. I think Mirkwood they've sent over an awful lot of their archers, their good archers as well, over here to deal with Rhudaur. At this point, I don't think you actually need range support to defeat Rhudaur. I think you can get away with it. Maybe just have one unit of archers to marshal the presence of like Trollshaw Axe Throwers and the Troll Hunters and their ranged threats, their throwing projectiles, but other than that, you'd be much better served saving a bit of ammunition, I think, for Rhun and Isengard. Otherwise you could end up being at the mercy of quite a lot of crossbows in the late game, which is never a good thing for defenders. It makes it very, very difficult. It means that very often you have to turn into the aggressors. Another unit of Blackwolds is moving forward. A dangerous foe, but Mirkwood better equipped than most to deal with them in a pure melee capacity. Sindar the Girdle have taken an awful lot of losses, but they've also dished out a lot of punishment. A little bit more than just that one unit of Hiri Alf to deal with a healthy unit of Blackwolds. That was one of the shots from the cannon. Narvrim continuing to try and do a little bit of damage to this front line. And they will do a decent amount of damage, I suppose, to Dwarven miners, but how important is that? This is a little bit more like it now from Isengard. They're paying the price for this though. The ballista is now going to be able to get some pretty decent bits of damage done, but the trolls to the White Hand, they're going to be able to break up those dwarven pikes. The elves that are in melee are out of ammo archers, capable of looking after themselves, but maybe not to the extent that they're being asked to here. Shield Guard moving forward, Greenwood Watchers using their throwing projectiles, Dwarven Archers, the Elven Ballista, but it's a little bit more like it from the attackers. They're pushing forward in numbers with support, the Trolls in the vanguard, Gamp, Rim and Gunlending Veterans following them in to try and keep the assault up. They're taking a lot of damage though. They need to get through this as quickly as they possibly can. That unit of 4th Legion in there just to try and hold them in place for a little bit longer. Unit of Hiri Penga there, 2nd Legion Axe Guard moving forward. That's exactly the sort of unit that will be good at shutting down the trolls with that big armor-piercing damage. Greenwood Rangers could turn around and start shooting into this force as it moves forward. The problem is, as soon as they get a good shot, that's a sign that they're going to be horribly exposed. Not what they will want to be seeing at all. Unit of Hiri Peng coming in. The trolls are starting to falter, but you could argue they've already done their job, but the defensive line has closed over again, so the trolls are now actually cut off. They can get in behind enemy lines and start making a nuisance of themselves, but they are ultimately going to fall by the wayside. Going after Greenwood Watchers, getting into the Orc Khazad, the Horse Archers are right there. The ranged units here, the Greenwood Watchers can do a lot of damage, but those Dwarven Archers and those Horse Archers are going to take damage at the hands of the trolls. They continue to fall by the wayside. Where did the 2nd Legion Axe Guard go? There they are. Ready to move in at some point. The Runic Artillery continues to fire in. There's not a huge amount of important units over here though, so this Runic pressure, again, I would ask how effective it is actually being. Flag Rim. More Valkosh Reitman. I mean, Rhun have still got plenty left in the tank to mount a decent assault over here. Still a couple of trolls left alive. For how much longer, I don't know. Trying to go after the ballista. There's not enough of them at this point to finish the ballista off. Two more. What remains of this Rhudaur assault? Surely it's Black Bolts in here, because they are a locked morale unit. Yeah, and it is. But they're going to be finished off as well, so another Rhudaur assault that has ended ultimately in failure, but I feel as though Tintin kind of knew that wasn't going to work. So the rest of his units that he has left, I mean, he's got his throwing projectiles left, he's got some Troll Shiraxra, some Javelins, he's got his bodyguard units, but he's got enough left in him for one decent assault left. So now I think is the time where he really needs to wait and let his allies pick up a bit of the slack, and then in the late game, he can also add himself to the equation once again. And that's when things can get a little bit ugly, because if you don't have the ability to respond to all of the crossbows, javelins and throwing axes that the attackers do still have at their disposal, for all that the defenders have been really solid so far, I don't think they're going to be able to put up a fight against that sort of thing. Victory seems certain. And this huge tide of defeat seems certain out of both sides. Guards of Orthanc arriving on the front. It will definitely give the Isengard push much more solidity. It'll be harder to hack their way through the best armour that Orthanc can provide, but even so, 2nd Legion Axe Guard arriving on the front line, the AP will be incredibly useful against the higher end Isengard units that are here. And the Greenwood Rangers now pushing forward as Rhun are now putting up a serious assault as well. The Dwarves actually caught a little bit flat-footed by the looks of things. Maybe seeing that Rhun were being a little bit sluggish themselves, they are now moving forward with Scion Rim in the vanguard, Gamp Rim backing them up, and this softened up front line for the Dwarves is crumbling pretty quickly. The Orc Hunters trying to get into position as well, but the combination of those Elven Rangers, which I think are moving now, and the Khazad Reclaimers should be enough to give Rhun pause. There's also more Orc Hunters over here. They're going to be able to push in those Pikemen and the Mighty Palace Guard as well, which are going to be able to, of course, butcher their way through one-on-one anything that Rhun have. So again, I say again to the attackers, they need to make this about numbers, which they have done in parts, but nowhere near enough in this battle, and nowhere near consistently. They can still do it though, as the Pikes and Palace Guard come in. Problem is, it's all well and good having all of those really nice support tools in the late game. If you don't have the infantry to back that up with, then they're just going to get hunted down in melee relatively easily. Meanwhile, Troll Shiraxra is trying to come forward, but again, completely without support, so the Sindar of the Girdle are just going to finish them off. And this depleted unit of Hiri out as well is going to make sure that they won't be able to get Rhun to actually get any of their volleys off. A real tragedy, but it's been a real theme of Rhudaur's assaults, just not big enough, not substantial enough to actually do much damage, but too big as well for it to be inconsequential, and too often, time and time again, we've seen their assaults end in failure. Well, this front line continues to do quite well for the Dwarves, that armour-piercing edge to it. Snaga skirmishers and E-strong crossbowmen doing some good damage, and ultimately they're going to be able to finish off the ballista if they continue to focus it down like this. That will be the end of the Mirkwood artillery, which could be a big misstep to put that in harm's way. We'll have to wait and see. Greenwood Watchers are here, but I also did notice as well the Uruk-hai Berserkers have arrived on the front line, which, considering this is a mostly Dwarven effort over here, that could be a real problem. They've got 3 hit points after all. Lots of armour-piercing damage. The Dwarves really not going to enjoy being in melee with them. And that could be exactly the sort of thing which gives the attackers the momentum they need to start pushing through here. Uruk-hai crossmen moving forward. The Nazkai are surely around here somewhere as well. Indeed, there they are. More Uruk-hai infantry. The Champions of the White Hand, if the battle gets stretched, if there are holes in the defensive line, like there are over here, the Champions of the White Hand could have been really effective. Yes, there are pikes here and there are stakes, but with a little bit of finesse, Champions of the White Hand could have caused some havoc. This runic assault has fallen apart again, however. The addition of the Palace Guard and the pikes, as well as the throwing axes from the Khazad reclaimers, have meant that once again the attackers are going to have to go back to the drawing board. Balkov tries moving over here, thinking they could maybe go around this way, but they cannot. There's not an awful lot of reinforcements over here though. I mean, the Palace Guard can re-engage if they need to. The Shield Guard, a healthy unit of Sons of the Fallen, including the one over there that got hit by the Dragon's Breath earlier. Meteor Guard are yet to be committed either, so the very strongest units that are available still waiting for their chance. Ettamor's trying to move forward. So Rhudaur now, they're throwing forward everything by the looks of things. So this is going to be Rhudaur's do-or-die moment in the fight, which, considering we're heading towards the final 10,000 frames, makes a certain amount of sense. I think the attacker's going to have to throw caution to the wind, try and break the defenders with one big push. Nazkai are moving in, Uruk-hai pikemen are moving in, so Isengard seem to be of a mind of that as well. They're going to go forward with everything that they have and hope that it's enough. Uruk-hai pikemen, we've seen them be so effective in the recent months when we've seen Isengard in action. A very depleted unit of Orc Hunters are going to do their best to help shore this defensive line up. But Isengard are going to win here without some substantial reinforcements. They may have to... I mean, there's no reinforcements on the way is the problem. Maybe they're hoping they can kill off Rhudaur quickly and then all of that force can turn around and meet the advancing Isengard. Rhun still yet to make any real progress. They're not routing all that quickly in the face of this Dwarven resistance. There's also the Sindar of the Girdle, who are incredibly depleted at this point, but still an annoyance, finally breaking off those depleted Scion Rim in conjunction with the Dwarven pipeline. The Sindar of the Girdle have been used pretty well in this fight, you'd have to say. Very dangerous unit. Champions of the White Hand, I think we're trying to help push through over here. Hammers of Gundabad are on their way across. That's a significant unit because they are locked morale, so it does mean that they will fight to the death. There will be Dwarven resistance to Isengard's push, regardless of how dominant Isengard become in this fight. Bolts raining down upon them there. Seeing the danger, perhaps, that these brass-clad dwarves pose to their push forward. The Palace Guard are on their way up here as well, so this is a significant amount of reinforcements coming across. Pretty much the best that the Elves have to offer, as well as a very strong unit from the Dwarves trying to help shore things up, trying to stop Isengard's progress dead in its tracks. Sindar of the Girdle, Khazad moving backwards, retreating in the face of the Balkov Tribesmen's javelin volleys, doing a little bit more damage to this depleted unit of Sons of Fallen. And I can see what they're doing now. They're going to pull back. So Rhudaur ultimately will be able to force their way up this hill, which is rather interesting. As a result of this retreat, the Sindar of the Girdle will cover the retreat as well. A good opportunity for them to do a little bit more damage against Balkov Tribesmen. Rhun are going to move forward, so Rhun and Rhudaur will now have the opportunity to move over here. This will be the final stand area, which I wasn't expecting. That is a little bit too exposed to use as a final stand, I suppose. Over here, you can bottle things up a little bit more. Balance of force is evenly matched, even with the Palace Guard and Hammers of Gundabad. It's only enough to even the fight against a still reasonably healthy Isengard. Arrows raining down on the Isengard infantry mass. the 4th Legion. Guard, I think they've taken actually a little bit of damage at the hands of the Rhudaur throwing projectiles, which would be an interesting thing to note. Still have Elders of the Elven King, which of course are very effective in melee as well. Snaga skirmish is very depleted. I mean, everything's starting to get a little bit more depleted. Wardens of Amon Lank, that armor piercing will be useful against the majority of the Isengard units. Less so the Berserkers, but everything else, those axes and their armor piercing will be helpful. Another unit of 4th Legion just to help shore things up, give some rigidity to that defensive line. And still more projectiles are forthcoming as well. Wooden Realm Patrol, very depleted. It's interesting, this fight doesn't have that much longer left in it, but yeah, it seems like both attackers and defenders still have a fair amount left to give. Ooh, hello. Those Khazad Reclaimers doing a good job there. They're getting some volleys into those Essenmoor's Troll Hunters. Ferodrum Javelins revealing themselves, so Tintin still had all of his strongest units left, but of course it just means that everything that gets hit now is a worthwhile target for the defenders. Those Ferodrum Javelins in particular are obviously a little bit less resilient than the Essenmoor's Troll Hunters. Even with their 2nd hit point, a lack of an armour and a shield does make them a dangerous target. Also, they're better in melee at dealing damage, so you want to get rid of them if you can. Well, some Greenwood Watchers over here, just getting in the way of a cohesive advance for Rhun. Still very dangerous units though, the Witchram Enslavers, Ranodine Berserkers. Whatever happened to Carmel's... yeah, there they are, Carmel's Chosen. Elves of the Elven King continuing to use their Silverthorn arrows, continuing to do good damage to the Rhudaur units. I mean, the problem that they may run into is Rhudaur are going to have ammunition left regardless of how the defenders approach this, really. They're continuing to throw units into this fight against Isengard, and they are turning the tide, the defenders. They're now beating Isengard back, but is it going to be enough? Snaga skirmishers doing some damage. There's still pikes that they need to force their way through. Some throwing axes coming this way as well, going after the Dragon's Breath crew. Crossbows are still going to be doing damage where they can. Those are perpetually routing units. There's still the problem of the Champions of the White Hand to deal with as well. If there's any weakness at all in this defense, the Champions of the White Hand could flood through and make life very, very difficult. Sons of the Fallen still there. Essenmoor's Troll Hunters in melee with a very depleted bunch of units, but it is blobbing the Rhudaur runic effort up just a little bit. I mean, it's hard to tell, because I do think that really either side could win this at this point. We have a look. Potential of allies killed. I mean, the defenders are ahead by 3%, but with all the ammunition that the attackers still have, that is easily the sort of thing which could turn around. They still have quality units of their own as well. That could be a key moment, though. The Rhudaur general falling could result in the... well, I say that, most of the Rhudaur units that are left are actually higher tier, so even with the loss of the general, they're very likely to keep fighting. Might be a little bit different if it were Isengard we were talking about, because they've got a lot of stuff like crossbows and Snaga, which could end up losing heart in the face of the loss of a general. And they're still forcing Isengard back on their heels. If not for the Uruk-hai pikemen, Isengard would be in genuine trouble here. The Khazad Reclaimers, axes out, going to force their way to the front. That bit of extra arm-piercing damage could be really, really important. There's still the Mithril Guard. I think the time might be now to try and commit the Mithril Guard to a fight somewhere. Maybe the other unit of Sons of the Fallen as well. Try and finish Rhun and Rhudaur off, or at least make it so that it's going to be difficult for them to use their projectiles. The Ferodrum Javelins are already here after all. They're going to try and, after the extremely high amount of damage they've already sustained, they're going to try and use their own Javelins now. And they're actually doing a pretty decent job of it. They are one of the better units of Javelins that the game has to offer. akin to something like the Medicel Guard, the Valkor Sapphire Bladesman. That one might actually be the best comparison because they're both fairly fragile to the same things. Kamal's chosen over here, actually doing quite well. The support of the Reforged Javelins as they hit the Elders of the Elven King, fairly important there. Where is Thranduil himself? Is he in the Elders of the Elven King? I don't think so, because they were hiding, so he must be in the Palace Guard. The two ballista crew are going to charge downhill. Everyone needs to do their bit here, including the dwarves, who I think, I mean, it is really now or never. You can tell that the fight is in a critical stage. He is committing his Mithril Guard over here, and they are going to make mincemeat of some Snaga. Scarcely will they have an easier fight. Balin himself is in there, and then they will also be able to help wrap up the line against primarily Isengard, but a few Easterlings over here giving them a hand as well. Champions of the White Hand biding their time, waiting. There's still 41 Nazkai to concern yourself with, but it is interesting. They're just allowing, really, the Snaga to do their thing. They're going to try and break these units. I mean, they are breaking some Snaga that are part of this. I don't think they're going to break the Dragon's Breath cannon crew, though. I mean, they've definitely buckled the cohesion of that front line. 24 Wardens of Amon Lanka over here. Sons of the Fallen are pushing in now, so better late than never. Trying to shore up this line with that extra bit of quality. Granadine Berserkers shooting. I mean, they need to get in as close as possible just so those E-Strong crossbows are not able to get excellent shots on them. That's the sort of thing you definitely need to avoid. Interesting. The Rhun general falling, that's again important. It's the sort of thing that these E-Strong crossbows could end up... And they have. There was a way through here. I mean, they could have gone through this building the whole time. That'll be something which the attackers will be very disappointed that they missed, because now even these smaller units of crossbows are being interrupted. Very real problem. The Wardens of Amon Lank charging into the backs of this front line, but it wasn't actually all that effective. And they're losing a little bit of ground here, but with those Granadine Berserkers on the front line, they could still turn this around for Reforged Javelins. So far the defensive line is holding, but I do wonder for how much longer, if those crossbows remain able to continue shooting. Those Wardens of Amon Lank should kill those E-Strong crossbows. It's very close, this battle, actually. The Mithril Guard needs to get back in there. They need to help out against the Nazkai, because these other Dwarven units are not going to be up to the challenge. I have to say, I think the attackers actually have got the edge in this battle now. I think purely the viciousness of their ranged support that they still had available in the late game has been a little bit too much for the defenders to bear, and the tempting target that all of those weak Rhudaur units made in the early game meant that the elves dumped an awful lot of their ammunition into units they could have just killed in melee. And these may be the margins that this battle is decided on, really. Well and truly into the final phases now. Victory is almost a certainty still for the Sons of the Fallen. The problem for a unit like the Granadine Berserkers here might be that there just isn't enough of them in comparison to other types of units, and they're going to be the ones that need to do the damage against something like the Sons of the Fallen. There's also still the Palace Guard. 23 of them is not a small amount. Admiral's Troll Hunters are breaking. Every man is going to be important in this fight, and now they're going to start to wrap up the line. So yeah, over here, even with those crossbows at this point, the crossbows will continue to do a lot of damage, but the defenders should win over here. It's against Isengard I'd be a little bit concerned, because there's still more units going through. The Champions of the White Hand are trying to force their way through the Dwarven defensive line. The Mithril Guard, as strong as they are, the Nazkai are one of the units you would want to face off against them, because that armour piercing is going to be so useful. It's going to be a bloody encounter though. Still, the fight is so close. Champions of the White Hand in behind enemy lines though. Hiriak are going to try and intercept them, but there's not that many of them left. Honestly, a charge from the Champions of the White Hand might be enough to finish them all off. They are able to pull these units off the front line over there though, now that they are achieving good dominance. Elders of the Elven King have pushed forward. They've taken damage from the crossbows as they've done so, but now I mean, there's so many of these crossbows, they might honestly be able to kill these elves in melee, but just stopping those crossbows from firing is the most important thing at this point, and Rhun are trying to get them out of there so they can shoot again, but it's a lost cause. You may as well commit them to melee at this point, because you cannot kite around with crossbows. They shoot too slowly, and the elves are going to be able to keep up with you anyway, so... While the Rhudaur line continues to throw itself against the dwarven wall, and they continue to not really make any ground, and this is the problem. They just didn't have the same level of quality. Whatever happens to the champions of the White Hand? They retreat again? They run away? And they aren't here anymore, but I don't see their corpses. Oh, there they are. They went back through the front line, and now there's only 4 of them remaining. So, indecision has killed those champions of the White Hand, really. And now there's some elven spearmen to help shore up this defence, which was getting a little bit more desperate as time went on. Again, just a matter of having a little bit of extra manpower might be enough, because while the Nazkai are still a danger, don't know how many of them there are necessarily anymore, though. Only 14 against 36 Mithril Guard. Yeah, the quality. The rest of these units over here, there's crossbowmen, there's a few Dunlending clansmen. Rhun admits defeat. That's his units gone, and with that, definitely this front line is going to fall apart. I mean, from here on out, I do think the defenders would have won anyway. So you could see it through to the end. You never know. But yeah, those champions of my hand, I'm not quite sure why they turned around to try and go back the other way, to be honest with you. It's a bit of a bemusing decision. There may well have been elven spears here, but once you've committed to that sort of movement, you need to try and get some charges. And even if it fails, it looks better for you if that fails than if you try to then retreat them and you end up losing most of them anyway. Going to be another close one, but certainly the defenders now pulling away, and that dwarven and elven quality has come through in the end. And you have to go back to the early stages of the battle where the attackers weren't making it about numbers. They were feeding too many kills into the elves and the dwarves. And like I said, you're not really going to win a quality battle in the late game against a Dwarven Elven alliance. It's going to be very hard for you. And ultimately that's what has happened. A little bit too much of that from the attackers. Got to be a little bit more either fully conservative, try and play the long game, or you need to be more aggressive. And I think in particular Rhudaur and Rhun were caught in between the two here. I think Isengard was a little bit more akin to what you would expect, trying to use their javelins while committing forward like really low tier units. It was a little bit more well executed from them, but ultimately still rather similar problems. And yeah, I think the defenders are worthy victors of this one as the Palace Guard charge forward, and they will finish off champions of the White Hand, the mounted Nazkai as they are. Hiriak charging forward. I don't think there's anything else that remains. It's just going to be these units over here. Palace Guard doing their thing. Very impressive performance from them. Be interested to see just how many kills the Elven Archers got, and we are watching this from Mirkwood's perspective, so we will get to see that. I also like the cohesion between the compositions of the elves and the dwarves here. I don't know if that was pre-planned or if that was accidental, but regardless, they played off against one another really rather well. And all those spears poking through the fence. The last of the Nazkai being dealt with here, and neither the Dwarven nor the Elven general fell in this battle. They both remained alive, which is more than you can say for that poor Isengard general. And there you go. A good victory for the defenders, which should make people happy, especially seeing it was elves defending. And it was well played as well. So yeah, like I said, it was a tough battle for Rhudaur for the reasons I mentioned. Similar for Rhun, although because they weren't as gung-ho as Rhudaur early on, it was less apparent for them, but the same problems were existent, I think. And like I said, Isengard a little bit better, but again, more cohesion for the team overall, and also just less of that filtering low tier units in and losing them for no good reason. It's a problem. Like, just because they're low tier units doesn't mean they're useless to you, and I feel as though that's a trap that a lot of people still fall into, even to this day, as evidenced by this one. But yeah, well played to the defenders. I think they were good value for their win. See what did the damage for Master Blaster, so over 200 kills on some infantry. Like I said, Mirkwood's infantry is a really good matchup. It's a good matchup for them when they're up against Rhudaur's infantry. Rhudaur's strength in melee comes from the fact that they're a little bit more damaging, but certainly with a focus around armor piercing, they obviously sacrifice a lot of their own defensive stats to do that, and that's the last thing you want against Mirkwood. So stuff like the Hiri Alf, going to be very effective. The Palace Guard maybe not getting as many kills as you would expect, but it was at key moments in the battle where they were committed. They broke up a runic assault, and then in the late game, obviously, their quality was really important against Isengard as well. Elders of the Elven King getting over 200 kills. Bows of Emondwyr, not too many. All of the archers doing pretty well. The Greenwood Rangers with 213 is not the most you've ever seen, but this is also maybe a bit more of a stretch battle. There wasn't too many blobs. The one really big blob that there was for Isengard, there wasn't a good angle for the Greenwood Rangers to use anyway. And Sindar the Girdle were the most impressive unit, 381 kills. Like I said, you got the sense when the battle was unfolding that they were being used quite well, and that ultimately was the case, I think you can say. Rhudaur in particular can attest to that, I'm sure. So yeah, big thank you to Master Blaster for sending this one in. Big thank you to all of the players as well for being a part of it. I don't believe this is a part of that episodic series. I think while it may be a Dwarven and Elven inspired one, I think the dwarves involved in that are actually Erebor, so I feel confident this isn't one of those. That may honestly be the next 3 battles I show, because as I've learned, the Eclipse scenario, the gold versus silver one, I've actually been given the wrong version of that. So I hope he still has the version that replay was on, otherwise I won't be able to show it, which would be a shame. Always enjoy showing off those. If I am able to get the correct version of that, that means I have 4 Reforged battles in my backlog. I technically have 5 Silmarillion ones, but as I said, kind of depends on if I can navigate the correct versions that I require for that. To actually be able to show them off. I'd hope to be able to get at least 1 or 2 of them, like I said, ideally more before the year's out. And yeah, other than that, I think by this point I will have been able to do my channel update live stream. I'll have to wait and see. It's one of those things which seems to be continuously getting pushed back, but hopefully. Maybe it... I mean, there is a reason maybe that I would want to push it back further as well, because there may be useful news later on, but whatever. I mean, I'm waffling at this point because it may very well have already have happened. So yeah, big thank you to Master Blaster once again and all the players. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll join me for whatever is next.